Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca. For this presentation, we are going to discuss the flooding that occurred at Camp Mystic in Hunt, Texas on July 4th, 2025. First, we're going to talk about a little bit of background information regarding what happened, what the crisis was, talk a little bit about the impact that the crisis had, any intersectional factors that influenced how the crisis was handled or what allowed the crisis to occur. Then we will go on to discuss the crisis model and how that applies to this crisis, and how this crisis would be assessed based on the crisis model of intervention. Then we will go on to talk about the human rights violations, any issues and factors that were in place that impacted how this crisis got to the point that it did. And then finally, we'll discuss a proposed intervention plan at the micro, meso, and macro level, and talk about mutual aid and trauma-informed practices to go along with the intervention. So, as mentioned, this will focus on the flooding that occurred at Camp Mystic on July 4th, 2025. Camp Mystic is an all-girls Christian camp that has been in operation for nearly 100 years, and it's set along the banks of the Guadalupe River in Hunt, Texas. The night of July 3rd, it had begun raining and there was a flash flood watch in effect. The director of the camp, Dick Eastland, was the camp director, and he had worked at the camp for 40 years at this point, if not more. And he was aware of the flash flood watch and was monitoring the weather throughout the evening of July 3rd and into the early hours of July 4th. At 1:14 a.m. on July 4th, 2025, very early in the morning on Friday, the National Weather Service issued the first flash flood warning. And then at 4:03 a.m., the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency warning, stipulating that there was extremely dangerous and life-threatening situation. At 2:30 in the morning on July 4th, 2025, some of the teenage counselors located in the Bug House and Look-In cabins, which were closest to the Guadalupe River, went to the office, the main office, and told Dick that water was starting to enter the cabins and were asking for help. At that point, Dick instructed them to put towels under the door to stop the water coming in. And then at 3 a.m., the Riverside front gate guard walkie-talkied Dick Eastman to tell him of flooding of the guardhouse. At this time, at 3 a.m., is when Dick Eastland decided to start evacuation of the campers. At this point, Dick had already known that the water levels were rising, and that there was a flash flood warning in place because he was monitoring the weather. At this point, Dick instructed everyone himself, he instructed himself, his son Edward, and the night guard to start evacuating the cabins, and instructed all of the campers and counselors to go to the rec hall. During this time, the water levels were already rising, and it was becoming an unsafe situation for evacuation. At one point during the evacuation, Dick Eastland loaded himself, all the campers, and both counselors from the Bubble Inn into his vehicle in an effort to evacuate them from the area. Unfortunately, It was swept into the Guadalupe River, and all of them died. In total, 25 campers died, 2 counselors, and Dick Eastland all died as a result of the flooding. The camp had over 500 campers in attendance. It was a very large camp. All of the girls who perished were between the ages of 8 and 9, and the counselors who passed away were teenagers, 18, 19 years old. To identify the impact that this crisis had, I think it's important to first define what a crisis is. So according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, there are a few different definitions for the word crisis. One of the definitions is an unstable or crucial time or state of affairs in which a decisive change is impending, one with the distinct possibility of a highly undesirable outcome. Another definition for crisis is a situation that has reached a critical phase. This event constitutes a crisis in the way that decisions had to be made for the well-being of the campers and counselors, and ultimately those decisions that were made resulted in negative outcomes. The flash flood warning alone constitutes a crisis, as the warning issued stated that there could be life-threatening flash flooding, alerting the public to the possibility of death if there was not an appropriate response to the warning. The primary victims of the crisis were the campers, counselors, and staff who were directly involved in the flooding. The survivors of the flooding faced a massive trauma for being in the flood itself and also having to process the grief of losing friends and counselors that they knew. The families of the individuals who died would be a secondary affected population, as they were not directly involved in the flood, but were directly impacted from losing children in the flood. The community as a whole would be another secondary affected population. Camp Mystic was not the only area to face loss during this flood, as there were over 100 people reported dead in Hunt, Texas, and the surrounding area as a result of this flash flooding. It's important to note that there were some intersectional factors that played a part in this crisis. For anybody familiar with building codes or buying a house or anything like that, you know that when you're in a floodplain, you have to have like additional insurance, and there are some regulations that you have to follow if you're building a house in that area or anything like that. Unfortunately, there is a gap in the regulations regarding the structure in flood zones and safety standards that were required for campgrounds and youth camps. So campgrounds did not have the same requirements or regulations as residential homes. So these cabins that were located in the floodplain did not have to be modified structurally or anything to match the requirements and regulations of a home, because they were located in a campground. This helped to set the stage for the crisis that ensued. Had there been enforced regulations for the structures that were located closest to the Guadalupe River, this could have minimized the fatalities that occurred and the loss of life. There may not have been as urgent of a need to evacuate the girls had there been changes made to the structures of those cabins prior to the floods taking place. It is important to note that this was not the first flood that occurred at Camp Mystic. There had been 3 previous massive floods that did take place at the camp. The first one occurred in 1932, where 4 people died and 3 cabins were washed away. In 1978, floods stranded Camp Mystic and cut it off from direct communication. There was no loss of life, but there was severe damage to the camp. And then finally, in 1987, there was another massive flood that did affect the structure of the cabins and created damage. It's also important to note that Dick Eastland did work at the camp in 1987 when that third flood occurred. And he then became very involved in flood prevention and wanting to make sure that there were safety procedures in place. However, this didn't translate to the camp itself in 2025. Youth camps are required to have written emergency plans in the case of an emergency. There was a one-page emergency plan that was placed throughout the camp that gave instructions on what to do in various emergencies, floods, fires, of the such. The written emergency plan for flood gave instructions to shelter in place during a flood. This guidance was not safe or appropriate, being that had the campers, some of the other campers stayed in their cabins, there would have been more loss of life because the flooding got so high. It's also important to note that the emergency plans had not been reviewed by counselors, reviewed with counselors or with the campers and what to do in the event of an emergency. So there was a lack of knowledge and planning and procedures in place that could have affected the outcome of this flooding in a different way. Next, we'll talk about the crisis model and how that applies to this, and how we would assess for crisis intervention. So the crisis model that I chose to apply to this event would be the hybrid model of crisis intervention. The basis of the hybrid model of crisis intervention is that there is a set of tasks that need to be completed with a client, but the way in which they can occur can vary depending on the client's needs. Previous models of crisis intervention stressed a linear progression of completing tasks with a client, whereas the hybrid model of crisis intervention realizes that a crisis does not occur in one specific order, and therefore intervention for a crisis is not going to occur in one specific order. I believe that this model would be especially effective in this crisis situation because there are a lot of people involved in the crisis between staff, campers, counselors, the families of the campers. So all of those people are experiencing this crisis and interpreting it and living it in a different way. And this model allows for the intervention to be more tailored to the person and not just the circumstance. The parents of the children who died are going to have different needs in this crisis compared to the children who survived the flood and the families of those children who survived the flood. For the parents who lost a child, an important task to utilize with them would be the third task of the model, which is providing support. The parents of deceased children are going to be going through a wide range of emotions, and they're all going to be grieving differently from one another, and therefore it's important to be ready to provide support for them. Whereas the staff dealing with the aftermath of the flood would benefit more from task one with predisposing, where the crisis intervention worker would focus more on making that initial contact and keep the interventions light to be able to provide assistance in whatever way the staff needs. In order to assess the immediate safety coping skills based on this model with the various people involved, I would use the triage assessment system. This allows the worker to be able to determine the severity of the client's current functioning in affective, behavioral, and cognitive domains. The worker would be using the ABCs of assessment, which will determine how the client is functioning in the affective state, behavioral state, and cognitive state. The worker will take note of what the client's affect is to assess the ongoing needs of the client. The worker will evaluate the way the client is reacting to the event, for example, if they are in a state of denial or delusion. And that will help to further determine what their needs are. The worker would also assess the behavioral state, where they will attempt to have the client complete some sort of a task to gauge their ability to behave and where their needs lie in that regard. By having the client complete a concrete task, the client is then able to move into a more productive and positive direction where they have an element of control restored to them. In assessing the cognitive state, the worker is determining the client's thinking patterns. By assessing the thinking patterns, the worker is able to gather information regarding how the client is processing the trauma or crisis in that moment. Along with assessing the state that the client is in, there are severity scales that correlate with each one of the states that I mentioned. And these would be included in the assessment of the client in crisis. By using the scales for the affective state, the worker will be able to determine if the client is a safety risk to themselves or others by gauging where they fall on the color scale. Whether they are anxious, angry, depressed, would fall on the color scale with respective colors. The cognitive severity scale will allow the worker to determine if and what coping skills the client has to deal with the crisis. The assessment will help the worker to determine if the client has an appropriate mindset to utilize appropriate coping mechanisms. The next section that we'll discuss is DEIA and human rights violations related to the crisis. One of the fundamental rights that was violated in this crisis was the right to safety. The girls and their family were told that they would be safe at camp. One of the TV screens at drop-off played a slideshow with a slide that said, "Camp Mystic is the safest place on earth." Despite this claim, the girls and the counselors were not trained on what to do in case of an emergency, specifically a flood, and therefore they were unable to gather information that would help ensure their safety. The girls were given directions that were unclear and unorganized. As a result of that disorganization, the safety of the girls was put into jeopardy. Dick Eastland, the camp director, did not prioritize the safety of the girls when the flash flood warning was originally given, and being that he was the director of the camp and had put the procedures in place that required his guidance on how to proceed in an emergency, the decision on how to move forward rested squarely on his shoulders. This was an institutional issue that led to the girls' right to safety being infringed. Had Dick made a decision at 1 a.m. when the flash flood warning was initially issued, there could have been very different outcomes. While there was a crisis that was faced by the girls and the staff at Camp Mystic during the flood itself, the crisis continued into how the crisis was handled after the fact. There was disorganization amongst agencies and the staff at Camp Mystic itself that resulted in information being shared incorrectly and at the wrong time to parents and others. Some parents were not given any notice about the whereabouts of their daughters, or they were told that their child was safe because they haven't heard anything, and then later they would be told that their child had not survived the flood. There was also disorganization amongst community agencies regarding where the families were supposed to go to collect their child, where families were supposed to go to get more information, and the information that was given to families was very limited and not always given to parents in a timely fashion. And those issues came from law enforcement agencies who were directing search and rescue efforts, as well as other community organizations who were assisting families in this time. Camp Mystic was largely ran by one person, as I've mentioned before, Dick Eastland. Dick had been the camp director and a co-owner of the camp for many years, decades. Dick created the policies and procedures on what to do in an emergency and how to respond after the emergency. There was not much delegation with the tasks in the written policies. As camp director, it was Dick's responsibility to ensure that the campers and the counselors were familiar with what to do in an emergency, and that did not occur. Had the campers and staff received some training, they would have been able to take action prior to the orders given by Dick, which could have affected the number of people who survived. Additionally, some counselors did notice that the water was starting to come into the cabin, and the direction given by Dick was to stay in the cabin and use towels to try to stop the water from coming in. This is an example of how the power dynamics affected the outcome of the crisis. Dick had the opportunity in that moment to take a different action that could have resulted in a completely different outcome. And because he was the only person in charge, ultimately he had the power to change the outcome. Another issue of power within the crisis was that there was a limited number of people who had access to outside information. Per camp rules, counselors and campers were not allowed to have cell phones in the cabins. Campers were not allowed to have cell phones at all, and counselors were only allowed to have them when they were on their time off. Counselors did not have walkie-talkies in the cabins and therefore had no access to information, and there was no quick or easy way for information to be dispersed to counselors, specifically during an emergency. The camp did have a public address system, a large intercom system that was used to deliver instructions to campers during the day. However, this system was not used during the flooding. Dick, as camp director, had the ability to make decisions to use that system that could have allowed for more information to be dispersed more quickly. Also, having policies in place that allowed counselors to have walkie-talkies in the cabins could have changed the outcome. Even before the flood, camp administrators failed the campers and the counselors. There were no or very limited evacuation plans documented for campers and counselors to follow in the event of the emergency. Per regulations of Texas, those were supposed to be hung in each building. As I mentioned before, the written emergency plans had scarce information and misinformation in the event of a flood, as it instructed campers and counselors to shelter in place. In response to the crisis, my proposed intervention plan would be as follows. At the micro level, I would propose individual counseling services to the families, children, and staff at Camp Mystic. The immediate need for the individuals involved in the flooding would be discuss with them the initial trauma that they experienced and help the children to understand what they experienced. The focus would be to stabilize the emotional needs of the individuals and determine the need for additional services in the future. This would not be intended to unpack all of the details with them, but rather to be able to stabilize their emotions in the moment. Allowing the children, families, and staff to talk about what they experience and what they are feeling in relation to that will help stabilize them in the moment so that they can complete the necessary tasks that they need to do in order to move on from this immediate situation. At the meso level, the intervention that I would propose would be facilitating peer groups to those affected by the flood. I believe this would be especially helpful for the children who survived because they may be more willing to talk about what happened in a group setting where their peers are talking about their experiences as well, and that would be relatable. This would allow the children and others involved in the peer groups to find support in each other as well, which would be helpful after crisis services are no longer present. This would allow them to have people to turn to who can understand the trauma that they have experienced. At the macro level, I would propose the crisis worker coordinating disaster relief agencies to come in and provide additional assistance and support to those in need. This would include coordinating where different agencies were physically located in the disaster area, as well as ensuring a range of agencies were present to meet all the various needs of the individuals. While some of the families were left to wait to find out about their daughter, the resource agencies would be available to provide an area for them to sleep or hot meals to eat. Additionally, ensuring that there are the right resources will help families and individuals affected be able to have their needs met during the crisis. The interventions proposed are designed to be person-centered and trauma-informed. In both the meso level and micro level, No individual would be forced to talk about their experiences. They would be allowed to talk about whatever they need to in that moment and not necessarily just what they had experienced. The goal of this would be to ensure that the individuals are not being re traumatized by forcing them to talk about what they had been through if they are not ready to talk about the experience. The goal would be to meet people where they are and meet their needs in that moment. At the macro level, trying to incorporate local relief agencies would allow individuals to make connections with people who can provide further support after the initial event. Including local relief agencies also shows the strength of the community because they are local agencies who are part of the community and will remain there to provide assistance after other relief agencies leave. There are some organizations that I think would be especially helpful in dealing with this crisis. First, FEMA, and they provide federal resources to local and state agencies for aid needs after disasters. The American Red Cross, they are able to provide safe and dry shelter, serve water and hot meals, help to entertain children, provide first aid, give comfort and emotional support, and meet with families to prepare recovery plans. The Salvation Army, providing emergency relief, also providing long-term recovery assistance through financial assistance, counseling services, and case management. Specifically to the state of Texas, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, which helps to guide and coordinate community resources, provides information regarding road and travel closures and power outages. And then finally, Team Rubicon, which are veteran volunteers designated to help with heavy cleanup tasks, and they also help to demolish unsafe structures after the disaster. As I noted before, this crisis didn't only affect Camp Mystic. There were many other people in the community who were affected. This agency would be helpful for other people coping through the crisis so that structures that were unsafe and served as a reminder of the flood could be taken down. This crisis happened a year ago, and since then, there have been 3 statutes enacted by Texas legislators to hopefully avoid this happening again in the future. Thank you for watching my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed.